They handed me two things when I left the orphanage: a black plastic bag containing everything I owned, and a folded legal document with my name typed in bold at the top. I was 18 years old. Sawyer had just turned 13. And as of that Tuesday morning in March, the system had officially stopped pretending we were anyone's responsibility. The director's office smelled like it always did: stale coffee and old carpet and something else underneath. Something institutional that I'd been breathing for 6 years without ever getting used to. Mrs. Vivian Marsh sat behind her desk with her reading glasses perched on her nose, not looking at me as she slid the paperwork across the scratched wooden surface. "Property transfer," she said. Her voice was flat, efficient, already moving on to the next case file. "Your grandfather's estate. The courts finally processed it." I stared at the document without touching it. Grandfather. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I'd learned as a child and forgotten. I remembered a man with thick hands and a quiet voice. A fishing trip when Sawyer was 4 years old. The smell of motor oil and coffee. A promise that I couldn't quite recall the words to. Then nothing. Years of nothing. "He passed 8 months ago," Mrs. Marsh continued, still not meeting my eyes. "The estate took time to settle. There were complications with the paperwork." "What kind of complications?" She adjusted her glasses with practiced precision. "The property is rural, agricultural land in Nebraska, 40 acres and an underground structure of some kind. A shelter, apparently. The county has it listed as decommissioned." "A shelter?" "A bunker." She said the word like it embarrassed her. "Cold War era. Structurally obsolete according to the county assessment. Maintenance liability assumed by inheritor." She finally looked up then, and something flickered across her face that might have been pity or might have been relief that we were finally leaving. "There's also the matter of your brother." Sawyer was waiting in the hallway. I could see him through the glass panel in the door, sitting on the same wooden bench where we'd both sat 100 times before. Waiting for meetings, waiting for decisions, waiting for someone to tell us what came next. He was small for 13, with shoulders that hunched forward whenever he was trying to disappear. His feet didn't quite reach the floor. He was swinging them slightly, the way he used to do when he was little and scared, and trying to pretend he wasn't. "He's only 13, Mrs. Marsh said. "You'll need to sign as his guardian. Legally, he becomes your responsibility the moment you walk out that door." She pushed another form toward me. More boxes to check. More signatures required. "The foster system could place him somewhere else," she added, her tone suggesting this was a reasonable alternative. "If you're not prepared for the responsibility." I looked through the glass at my brother. He was staring at his shoes now, his lips moving slightly like he was talking to himself. Probably counting. He did that when he was anxious. Counted things to keep his mind from spinning out of control. "No," I said. "He stays with me." I signed both documents. The property transfer, the guardianship papers. My signature looked like someone else's handwriting, shaky and uncertain. Mrs. Marsh gathered the papers and tapped them into a neat stack. "The bus station is 3 blocks east," she said. "Greyhound runs twice daily to most destinations." She paused, seeming to reconsider whatever she'd been about to say. "I'd suggest you leave soon, before the weather changes." I stood up. The black plastic bag sat on the floor beside my chair, holding 6 years of accumulated possessions. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a paperback novel with the cover torn off. Sawyer's things were in an identical bag waiting by the front door. "Mrs. Marsh," she looked up from her paperwork with an expression of mild impatience. "The document mentions guardianship petitions, 3 of them, 2015, 2017, 2019. Something shifted in her expression, a wall going up, a door closing. "Those were denied," she said carefully. "The petitioner didn't meet the state's requirements for foster placement. The petitioner was my grandfather." Silence. "He tried to take us," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. 3 times. He tried to bring us home, and you never told us." Mrs. Marsh removed her glasses and set them on the desk with precise movements. Her face had gone blank in that particular way that meant the conversation was over. "Mr. Webb, the decisions of this institution are made in the best interest of the children in our care. Your grandfather was elderly, living alone in a rural area with limited financial resources. The state determined that you and your brother were better served by remaining in the system. Better served? That was the determination. I picked up the plastic bag. It weighed almost nothing. Everything I owned in the world, and it weighed almost nothing. Thank you for your service, I said. I walked out without looking back. Sawyer stood up when I came through the door. His bag was clutched against his chest like a shield, and his eyes were doing that thing they did whenever something uncertain was happening, darting around the room looking for exits. What did she say? We're leaving. Leaving where? I put my hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the front entrance. The hallway stretched ahead of us, lined with bulletin boards and safety posters, and all the institutional decorations that were supposed to make this place feel like something other than what it was. Nebraska, I said. We inherited some land. From who? Grandpa Emmett. Sawyer stopped walking. His face did something complicated, cycling through expressions too fast for me to read. Confusion, recognition, something that looked almost like pain. I remember him, he said quietly. He took me fishing once. I caught a bluegill and he said, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't remember what he said. He said you were a natural. Did he? Yeah. I didn't actually remember if that was true, but it felt like something our grandfather would have said. Come on, bus station's 3 blocks east. We walked out into the gray March morning. The air smelled like exhaust and wet concrete and the particular staleness of a city waking up to another ordinary day. Behind us, the door of St. Catherine's closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Neither of us looked back. The Greyhound station was crowded with people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Businessmen with briefcases checking their watches, college students with backpacks and headphones, lost in their own worlds. A woman with 2 small children who kept running in circles around her legs while she tried to read the departure board. I bought 2 tickets to Ashford, Nebraska. The clerk was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who looked at our bags and our ages and our general air of displacement with the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen it all before. One way? He asked. Yes. That'll be $47. I counted out the bills carefully. We had $83 between us. Everything we'd managed to save from odd jobs and birthday gifts over the years. 36 left after the tickets. Not enough for food for long, not enough for anything really, but enough to get there. The bus left at 11:15. We found seats near the back, away from the other passengers. Sawyer took the window and pressed his forehead against the glass as the city began to slide past. First the downtown buildings with their reflective windows, then the sprawling suburbs with their identical houses, then the long stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever. I pulled out the property documents and spread them across my lap. The language was dense and legal, full of phrases that seemed designed to obscure more than they revealed. But buried in the middle of the second page, I found what I was looking for. A small notation in faded typewriter font. Guardianship petition filed by Emmett Webb, 2015. Denied. Basis. Petitioner's advanced age and rural location deemed unsuitable. Guardianship petition filed by Emmett Webb, 2017. Denied. Basis. Petitioner's limited financial resources insufficient for dependent care. Guardianship petition filed by Emmett Webb, 2019. Denied. Basis. Children determined to be adequately served by current placement. Adequately served. I read the words 3 times, feeling something twist in my chest that I didn't have a name for. He'd tried. 3 times he'd tried to bring us home. And 3 times the system had decided that a crumbling orphanage with rotating staff and institutional food was better than a grandfather who loved us enough to fight for us. I looked over at Sawyer. He was still watching the landscape scroll past, his breath fogging small circles on the glass. Hey, I said quietly. He turned. He didn't forget us. I held up the document so he could see the notation. Grandpa, he tried to get us out. 3 times. Sawyer read the words slowly, his lips moving slightly. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something raw and wounded and hopeful all at once. They wouldn't let him. No, they said he was too old, too poor, too far away. But he wanted us? Yeah, Sawyer. My voice came out rougher than I intended. He wanted us. My brother turned back to the window, but something in his posture had changed. His shoulders weren't hunched anymore. He was sitting up straighter, looking at the passing landscape like he was seeing it for the first time. How long until we get there? 4 hours, maybe 5. Sawyer nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Okay. We watched the highway together as the miles unrolled beneath us, carrying us towards something neither of us could imagine, toward a grandfather we'd never really known, toward a piece of land we'd never seen, toward whatever was waiting for us beneath the Nebraska soil. The bus hummed and swayed. Outside, the flat farmland stretched to every horizon, broken only by occasional windmills and the distant shapes of grain silos. I folded the documents carefully and put them back in my pocket. For the first time in 6 years, we were going home. Even if we didn't know what that word meant yet, the Greyhound dropped us at a gas station on the edge of Ashford, Nebraska, population 3,200. It was late afternoon by then, the sky turning that particular shade of gray that promised cold nights and uncertain weather. The town wasn't much to look at. A main street with a feed store and a hardware shop and a diner with red vinyl booths visible through fogged windows. A church steeple rising above the low rooftops. A water tower with Ashford painted on the side in letters that had faded to ghosts of themselves. A man at the gas station gave us directions to Emmett Webb's property. Webb Place? He scratched his chin and looked us over with the careful assessment of someone who knew everyone in town and recognized strangers on sight. That's out past the Holloway farm. 5 miles, maybe 6. You boys walking? Yes, sir. He shook his head slowly. Long walk. Road's not paved past the grain elevator. Gets rough after that. We'll manage. You family? Grandchildren? Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or memory, or something sadder than either. Emmett Webb, he said quietly. Good man. Kept to himself mostly, but helped out when neighbors needed it. Sorry for your loss. I nodded, not trusting my voice to respond. The walk took nearly 2 hours. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt tracks cutting through dried prairie grass. The wind picked up as we walked, pushing against our backs like it was trying to hurry us along. Sawyer didn't complain. He walked with his bag over his shoulder and his eyes on the horizon, watching the landscape change from farmland to open grassland to something wilder and less cultivated. Is this all his? He asked when we'd been walking for an hour. I don't know, maybe. It's so empty. It was. Miles of nothing but grass and fence posts and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees marking where water might be. The sky seemed bigger out here, pressing down with a weight I could almost feel. We came over a small rise and stopped. The property spread out before us, 40 acres of overgrown grassland, bounded by sagging fence lines. There was no house, no barn, no visible structure of any kind. Just land. Empty land stretching toward the horizon. Where's the house? Sawyer's voice was small and uncertain. Colton, where's the house? I scanned the property, looking for anything that might indicate human habitation. And then I saw it. A low concrete mound rising barely a foot above the prairie grass. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Easy to dismiss as a natural formation or an old foundation. But there was a steel hatch set into the top, and a ventilation pipe rising nearby, bent slightly sideways, disguised among the fence posts. There, I said, pointing. That's it. Sawyer stared. That's the house? That's the shelter, the bunker Grandpa built. My brother looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. We left St. Catherine's for this? I started walking toward the concrete mound, my bag swinging against my leg. We left St. Catherine's because there was nothing left for us there, I said over my shoulder. This is something. I don't know what yet, but it's something. The hatch was heavy steel, rusted around the edges, but still solid. A padlock held it closed, old but intact. I remembered the key that had been taped inside the envelope with the property documents. It had seemed like an odd detail at the time. Now it made sense. I pulled out the key and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a sound like a held breath being released. The hatch resisted at first, then lifted with a heavy metallic groan. Cold air rushed upward, not damp or moldy, just still. The kind of air that hadn't moved in a long time. Steel stairs led down into darkness. Not a ladder. Proper stairs, with handrails bolted to the concrete walls. I looked at Sawyer. He was staring at the opening with wide eyes, his earlier disappointment replaced by something that might have been wonder or might have been fear. Ready? He nodded slowly. Stay close, I said, and watch your step. I descended first, one hand on the railing, feeling my way down into the underground darkness. The stairs went deeper than I expected, maybe 15 feet, before leveling out onto a concrete floor. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, and stopped breathing. What? Sawyer bumped into me from behind. What is it? I couldn't answer. My legs wouldn't move. This wasn't possible. The county had called it obsolete. Mrs. Marsh had called it worthless. Everyone had told us we were inheriting a liability, a hole in the ground that would cost more to fill than it was worth. But this was a fortress. The bunker wasn't a concrete coffin or a cramped survival hole. It was a reinforced chamber, rectangular, roughly 25 feet long and 15 feet wide. Concrete walls thick enough that the edges rounded slightly at the corners. Steel beams running across the ceiling every 3 feet. Metal shelving units lined one wall, stacked with supplies in organized rows. Along another wall stood a control panel with circuit breakers and ventilation toggles and 2 analog pressure gauges. A row of old fluorescent light fixtures hung from the ceiling, dark but intact. At the far end, a second sealed door with a manual wheel lock. Colton? Sawyer's voice was barely a whisper. Is this real? I reached out and touched the nearest steel beam. Cold, solid, absolutely real. Yeah, I whispered back. It's real. He built us a castle underground, and nobody knew. I walked to the control panel. It wasn't military-grade complex. It was simple and practical. Circuit breakers labeled in faded handwriting. Ventilation toggles marked intake and exhaust. The pressure gauges showed readings I didn't understand, but that seemed stable. Beneath the panel, mounted against the wall, were battery banks. Old but intact. I crouched and ran my hand across one. Dry, not corroded. The county said this was obsolete, I said half to myself. They said it was worthless. But nothing about this place looked worthless. Every system was organized, maintained, designed with obvious care and expertise. This wasn't the work of a paranoid old man building a hole in the ground. This was engineering. I stood and walked to the second door. The wheel lock turned smoothly, and the door swung inward to reveal a smaller room. Storage shelves stacked with sealed containers. Metal canisters labeled in faded marker with words like water filtration, supplies, and emergency rations. A compact diesel generator encased in a steel housing. Ventilation pipes angling upward into separate channels that probably exited somewhere hidden on the property. He thought of everything, Sawyer said from behind me. He really thought of everything. I noticed a metal box tucked beneath one of the lower shelves. It was secured with a simple latch, no lock. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were documents, engineering diagrams, handwritten notes in precise, careful script, old photographs in a yellowed envelope, and a letter. I unfolded it carefully, the paper thin with age, but the handwriting still clear. To my grandsons, it began. If you are reading this, it means you didn't sell the land. Good. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who measured his words carefully. This shelter isn't for hiding from bombs. It's for surviving what comes when systems fail. I built it in 1963, reinforced it in 1974, upgraded the ventilation in 1982. The county never updated their records. Let them think it's useless. I looked up at Sawyer. He was reading over my shoulder, his breath warm against my ear. They'll say it's a liability. They'll say it's outdated. They'll say you should sell it. Don't. Structures like this matter when the wind doesn't stop. The word stuck with me, wind. I turned the letter over, looking for more, and found it at the bottom of the second page, written in slightly shakier handwriting as if added later. I wrote 147 letters to St. Catherine's over the years. All of them were returned. They said you didn't have any living relatives. They said you were adequately served by current placement. I fought them in court 3 times. I lost 3 times. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. I'm sorry I couldn't find another way. This shelter is everything I could give you. I hope it's enough. The paper trembled in my hands. Or maybe my hands were trembling. I couldn't tell anymore. 147 letters. All returned. All denied. Sawyer reached past me and pulled one of the photographs from the envelope. A woman with dark hair and a warm smile, standing in front of a farmhouse with her hand resting on a round belly. Is that Mom? I looked at the photograph. I didn't remember our mother. She died when Sawyer was a baby, and I was 5. Too young to hold on to more than fragments. A voice, a smell, the feeling of being held. But looking at this photograph, I saw echoes of my brother's face in her cheekbones. Echoes of my own face in the set of her jaw. Yeah, I said. I think that's her. Sawyer stared at the photograph for a long time. When he looked up, there were tears running down his face. He kept pictures of her, of us, of everyone. He remembered us, I said, even when we didn't remember him. Outside, somewhere above the concrete and steel, the wind was starting to pick up. I could hear it faintly through the ventilation shafts, a low moan that seemed to come from very far away. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the metal box. Come on, I said. Let's see if we can get the lights working. We're staying here tonight. Sawyer wiped his face with his sleeve and nodded. We had a lot of work to do. The generator took 3 days of work before it coughed to life. Chester Rawlings showed up on the second day, appearing at the hatch like a man who'd been expecting us all along. He was 67 years old with hands roughened by decades of electrical work and a face that had seen every kind of weather Nebraska could produce. Emmett's grandboys, he said, looking us over with obvious assessment. He talked about you. Every single time I saw that man, he talked about you. You knew our grandfather. 40 years. Chester lowered himself down the stairs with the careful movements of someone whose joints weren't what they used to be. Helped him wire this place back in 73. Upgraded the ventilation system in 82. Your grandfather wasn't crazy, whatever people around here might have said. He was an engineer, a damn good one. He walked through the bunker with familiarity, checking systems and gauges and connections like a doctor examining an old patient. Fuel lines are dry but intact, he said, crouching beside the generator. Need to clean the injectors. Replace this hose here. It's cracked. Drain the old residue from the tank. You know how to do all that? Chester looked at me with something like amusement. Boy, your grandfather taught me half of what I know about keeping things running. The least I can do is pass it along. He stayed for 6 hours that first visit, teaching me the systems, explaining the engineering, telling stories about a man I wished I'd had more time to know. He never stopped trying, Chester said as we worked on the generator together. 3 court cases, dozens of letters to state agencies, phone calls every week asking about appeals, about new programs, about anything that might help him get you boys home. Why did they keep saying no? Because the system doesn't care about love. Chester's voice was matter of fact, without bitterness. The system cares about boxes you can check. Income level, square footage, distance from schools. Your grandfather didn't check enough boxes, so they kept you in a building full of strangers instead. On the 3rd attempt, the generator coughed and sputtered and roared to life. The sound filled the chamber like a heartbeat. I flipped the breaker panel. 2 fluorescent lights flickered weakly, then steadied. Electricity, independent of the grid, independent of everything. Don't run it longer than you need to, Chester warned. Fuel's limited until you can resupply. But in an emergency, this thing will keep you alive when everything else fails. I looked at him. What kind of emergency are you expecting? Chester nodded toward the small battery-powered radio on one of the shelves. Been listening to the weather service. Big system coming in from the north. They're calling it unseasonable. I'd call it early winter dropping in to say hello with its boots on. He climbed the stairs slowly, his knees protesting every step. Got my number written on that notepad by the control panel. Call if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll check on you in a few days. He paused at the top of the stairs. Your grandfather would have been proud of you, son. Coming all this way, taking care of your brother, staying when anyone else would have sold this place and run. Then he was gone. the hatch closing behind him with a heavy thud. That first night in the bunker, I lay awake on my sleeping bag and listened to the silence. It was different from the silence I knew. The orphanage was never truly quiet. There was always someone crying or coughing or walking the halls. Always the hum of fluorescent lights and the rattle of old pipes. A silence full of small sounds that reminded you constantly that you were not alone. This silence was different. This was the silence of earth and concrete and steel. The silence of a place designed to keep the world out. Sawyer was asleep on the other side of the chamber, his breathing slow and even for the first time in months. The bunker's temperature held steady at 55 degrees, cool but not cold. The thick concrete walls seemed to absorb every sound. I thought about my grandfather, about the man I barely remembered, who had spent decades building this place, who had written 147 letters that were never delivered, who had stood in courtrooms and argued for the right to raise his own grandchildren, and lost and kept trying anyway. Adequately served by current placement. The words circled in my mind like a song I couldn't stop hearing. At some point, I must have slept, because when I opened my eyes again, there was a sound coming from above. Not the wind, though the wind was there too, louder now than it had been before. This was something else, a voice crackling with static. I sat up and looked around the chamber. The sound was coming from the small battery-powered radio I'd found on one of the shelves earlier. I'd turned it on out of curiosity, not expecting to find any signal. But now a voice was speaking through the static, urgent, and mechanical. Rapid pressure drop, high winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, heavy snowfall expected, possible multi-day grid disruption, residents advised to shelter in place. I got up and walked to the radio, adjusting the dial until the voice came through more clearly. Winter system forming early, unseasonably aggressive, temperatures expected to drop below 0 Fahrenheit. This is an emergency weather advisory for the following counties. I looked at the ceiling, at the steel beams and concrete, and the ventilation pipes leading up to a surface I couldn't see. October. It was only October. Storms like this weren't supposed to hit yet, but I remembered what my grandfather had written. Structures like this matter when the wind doesn't stop. I walked to the hatch stairs and climbed halfway up, pressing my ear against the cold steel. The wind was howling now, not the gentle moan of earlier, but a sustained roar that seemed to shake the very air. I descended back into the bunker and looked at my brother, still sleeping peacefully on his sleeping bag. We were as ready as we could be. I turned off the radio and sat down with my back against the concrete wall. Outside, the storm was coming, and we were exactly where we were supposed to be. The storm hit at 2 in the morning on the 5th day. It didn't build slowly like normal snow. The wind came first, sharp and sustained and violent. Above ground, it sounded like the land itself was being scraped clean. Underground, the sound was muted but present, a distant vibration that hummed through the concrete like low thunder. Sawyer woke up gasping. "What is that?" "The storm." I was already at the control panel, checking the ventilation gauges, making sure everything was sealed properly. It hit faster than they predicted. "It sounds like a train." It did. A train that never passed, that just kept coming and coming without end. I turned on one overhead light for a few minutes, just to ground us both. Then I shut it off to conserve fuel. "We're okay," I told Sawyer. "The bunker's designed for this. Grandpa built it to last." The temperature inside held at 54 degrees. Outside, according to the radio, it had dropped to 3 below 0 Fahrenheit and was still falling. By dawn, the wind was howling hard enough that we heard something collapse in the distance. Metal tearing, then snapping, then silence swallowed by the storm. At 8:17 in the morning, the radio signal cut out. No warning, just static, then nothing. The grid had failed. I wasn't surprised. Overhead lines in rural areas weren't built for early season heavy snow. When trees still carried their leaves, wet snow accumulated fast. Add wind, and the weight multiplied until something broke. I walked through the bunker slowly, checking seams and joints the way Chester had taught me. No condensation forming on the ceiling. Drainage channel dry. Air moving steadily through the intake vents. The structure wasn't fighting the storm, it was ignoring it. That's the advantage of earth-sheltered design. Wind doesn't batter walls that aren't exposed. Snow can't pile against surfaces that are already buried. Weight presses downward into reinforced slabs instead of sideways against siding. The bunker wasn't resisting. It was cooperating with gravity. Colton? Sawyer was sitting on his sleeping bag, hugging his knees to his chest. How long will it last? I don't know. The radio said multi-day. Could be 2 days. Could be 5. Will we be okay? I walked over and sat down beside him. Yes, Sawyer. We'll be okay. This is exactly what Grandpa built this place for. We've got food. We've got water. We've got shelter. Everything else is just waiting. He nodded slowly, but I could see the fear still there behind his eyes. 13 years old. Half his life spent in an institution where someone else made all the decisions. And now this. Now us, alone in the dark while the world tried to tear itself apart above our heads. Tell me about him, Sawyer said quietly. Tell me about Grandpa, what you remember. So I did. I told him about the fishing trip, the only one I could clearly recall, about the way Grandpa Emmett's hands moved when he was working, precise and unhurried, like time was something he controlled rather than something that controlled him. About the coffee he drank, black with no sugar. About the way he smiled without showing his teeth, like he was keeping his happiness private, saving it for the people who mattered. And somewhere in the middle of telling, Sawyer fell asleep again. I sat with him until the wind died down enough for silence to creep back in. Then I went back to checking systems and waiting for what came next. The pounding came on the morning of the second day. At first I thought it was debris hitting the hatch. Ice maybe, or a branch torn loose by the wind. Then it came again. 3 sharp metallic strikes. Deliberate, intentional, human. I climbed the stairs fast and pressed my ear to the steel. Voices. Faint but real. I turned the wheel lock and pushed. The hatch resisted, snow drifting against it. I pushed harder, and it opened enough for me to see 2 figures standing waist-deep in white, their faces red from cold, their coats dusted with frost. A man in his late 50s with a weathered face and worried eyes. A younger man, maybe 19 or 20, standing behind him with his arms crossed against the cold. Our furnace died, the older man said between breaths. Power's been out 36 hours. Roads are completely buried. We saw the pipe sticking up and remembered this place from years back. The ventilation post. They'd spotted it above the snow line and followed it here. Get inside, I said. They descended the stairs slowly, their eyes scanning the chamber with obvious disbelief. It's warmer than outside by 20 degrees, the older man whispered, his breath still visible in the air, but no longer crystallizing instantly. It's stable, I said. Underground holds temperature better than any building. The older man introduced himself as Garrett Holloway. The younger one was his nephew Bryce. Garrett looked around the bunker with something like wonder. Emmett Webb built all this? I knew he was working on something out here, but I never imagined. You knew my grandfather? Neighbors for 30 years. He kept to himself mostly, but we talked sometimes at the feed store, at church. Good man. Quiet, but good. Bryce wasn't talking. He was walking along the shelves, examining the supplies, the control panel, the stored equipment. His expression was difficult to read. Calculating, maybe, or hungry. There's 2 of you, Garrett said, noticing Sawyer for the first time. Boys, I assume? Emmett mentioned grandchildren once or twice, but I thought we were in foster care, I said. In Ohio, he couldn't get custody. Something crossed Garrett's face. Regret, maybe, or shame, or just the recognition of a familiar tragedy. He talked about you, he said quietly. Every time I saw him at the diner or the hardware store, said he was going to bring you home eventually, no matter how long it took. Bryce had stopped by the control panel. He turned around and looked at me with an expression that had hardened into something less friendly. Nice setup, he said. Must be worth something. The land, the equipment, all of it. It's not for sale. Didn't say it was. But his eyes said something different. His eyes were already counting. More people came as the storm continued. Loretta Holloway arrived next, Garrett's wife. She was 60 years old with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of face that had learned how to be strong without losing its gentleness. She brought blankets and food wrapped in aluminum foil and a presence that seemed to fill the underground space with warmth. "Lord have mercy," she said when she saw Sawyer huddled on his sleeping bag. "You're just a child. Come here, honey. Let me look at you." Sawyer didn't move at first. He wasn't used to that kind of attention, the maternal kind that expected nothing in return. But something in Loretta's voice must have reached him, because he stood up slowly and let her examine him like a doctor, checking for injuries. "Thin as a rail," she murmured, running her hands along his arms, checking for signs of cold damage. "When did you eat last? Real food, not crackers and whatever else you've been surviving on." "Yesterday, some canned soup and—" "That's not food, that's surviving." She turned to the supplies she'd brought. "Let me heat this up. Casserole, beef and potatoes. Good solid food that sticks to your ribs." We didn't have anything to heat food with except the generator, and I didn't want to run it for cooking when we might need it for the ventilation system or the lights. But Loretta produced a small camping stove from somewhere and had a pot of stew warming within minutes. "Eat," she told Sawyer, handing him a bowl. "Eat until you're full, and then eat a little more." Sawyer ate like he'd never seen food before. Loretta watched him with an expression I couldn't quite identify until I realized what it was. Loss. The look of someone seeing a ghost they'd loved and mourned. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly. "My son. He passed 15 years ago. Car accident. Would have been about your age now if he'd lived." Sawyer looked up from his bowl. "I'm sorry." "Don't be, honey. It's not a sad memory anymore. Just a tender one. Some holes never fill, but they don't have to keep hurting forever." The Delgado family arrived next, having followed the same fence lines that Garrett had used to navigate through the whiteout. Manny and Teresa with their two children, Lucia and Marco, ages 8 and 5. They were cold and frightened and so relieved to find shelter that Teresa started crying the moment she was inside. "The roads are completely gone," Manny said, stamping snow from his boots. "Nothing but white in every direction. If we hadn't seen the smoke from your ventilation pipe, we might have walked right past." By evening of the second day, there were 10 of us in the bunker. Colton, Sawyer, Garrett, Loretta, Bryce, Chester, who had made his way back through the storm to check on us, Manny, Teresa, Lucia, and Marco. 10 people in a space designed for maybe half that. But it worked. The bunker had enough room to not feel dangerously crowded. The ventilation system moved enough air to keep everyone breathing comfortably. And somehow, despite all the tension and fear and uncertainty, there was food to share, and warmth to gather around, and the simple comfort of not being alone. Except for Bryce. Bryce watched everything with calculating eyes. He helped when asked but never volunteered. He spoke when spoken to but offered nothing of himself. And when he thought no one was looking, he stared at the supplies and the equipment and the control panel with an expression that made me deeply uncomfortable. "What's his problem?" Sawyer whispered to me that night. "I don't know, but keep your distance." Now I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. If you were in Colton's position, what would you do? A stranger in your home, looking at your possessions like they already belong to him, a storm raging outside with no end in sight, and a brother depending on you to keep him safe. Would you confront him? Would you wait and watch? Would you try to make peace? Let me know in the comments what you would do. And if you're not already subscribed, now's a good time. Because what happens next is going to test everything Colton thought he knew about survival. The storm wasn't the real danger. The real danger was already inside. On the third night, I found Bryce standing in front of the control panel, studying it. "Interesting setup," he said without turning around. "Your grandfather built all this himself?" "With help from Chester, over about 20 years. Must have cost a fortune. All this concrete, the steel beams, the generator system." "I don't know what it cost." Bryce turned around then, and the mask he'd been wearing slipped just slightly. Something ugly underneath. Something that had been waiting for this moment. "You know my uncle tried to buy this land? Made an offer about 10 years back. $15,000 down payment?" I didn't say anything. "Your grandfather accepted the offer, signed a preliminary agreement, then backed out at the last minute. Said he was waiting for his grandsons." Bryce's lip curled. "Cost my uncle his down payment. Non-refundable. the contract said. I didn't know about that. No, you wouldn't. You were in some orphanage in Ohio, right? Living off the state's dime while your grandfather was out here playing games with other people's money? That's not... You know what $15,000 means to a farming family? Bryce took a step toward me. That was savings. That was years of work. That was my uncle's retirement fund. And your grandfather just kept it. I'm sorry that happened, but I didn't... You didn't do anything. I know. You were just a kid. It's not your fault. Bryce smiled, but there was no warmth in it. But you're here now, and so is this land, and so is all this equipment that my uncle paid for and never received. The land belongs to me and my brother. That's what the legal documents say. Documents? Bryce laughed softly. Documents say what lawyers want them to say, and lawyers cost money. How much money you got, orphan boy? I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides. You should go back to sleep, I said. Storm's supposed to get worse tomorrow. Bryce looked at me for a long moment. Then he shrugged and walked back toward his sleeping area. We'll talk more later, he said over his shoulder. Plenty of time. We're not going anywhere. I stood by the control panel for a long time after he left, watching the gauges and listening to the ventilation system hum. Outside, the wind screamed and howled. Inside, the real storm was just beginning. On the fourth day, the ventilation failed. Sawyer noticed it first. He was sitting against the wall, reading one of the old books we'd found on the shelves, when he suddenly looked up with a confused expression. Does the air seem heavy? I walked to the control panel and checked the gauges. The intake pressure was dropping. The exhaust readings were normal, which meant air was leaving, but new air wasn't coming in. Everyone stay calm, I said. We've got a blockage in the intake vents. Probably snow packed too tight for the system to pull through. What does that mean? Teresa asked, pulling her children closer. It means someone needs to go outside and clear the pipes. The room went quiet. Outside, the storm was at its worst yet. The wind was hitting 60, maybe 70 miles per hour. Visibility was 0. Temperature was somewhere below -10. Going out there wasn't just uncomfortable. It was potentially fatal. I'll do it, I said. No! Sawyer grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. No, Colton, you can't. Someone has to. If the vents stay blocked, we'll run out of breathable air. CO2 will build up. It'll happen slowly enough that we might not notice until it's too late. Then let someone else go. Someone bigger. Someone older. Someone what? Sawyer's eyes were filling with tears. Someone I don't need as much. I knelt down in front of my brother. Listen to me. I know these systems better than anyone here except Chester, and Chester can't make it in this weather with his knees. I have to be the one. What if you don't come back? I'm coming back, I promise. You can't promise that. You can't promise something you don't control. I looked at him. 13 years old, half his life spent with no one to depend on. And now, finally, he'd started to believe he had family again. Started to believe he wouldn't be alone. You're right, I said. I can't promise, but I can tell you that Grandpa built this place so we could survive. Every system, every backup, every piece of engineering. He thought of everything so his grandchildren would have a fighting chance. And I'm not going to let all his work be for nothing. Bryce's voice cut through the moment. Seems like a lot of risk for a kid who just showed up. Maybe we should wait and see if the vents clear themselves. I turned to look at him. And if they don't? If the air goes bad while we're waiting? Bryce shrugged. Then we deal with it when it happens. People could die, Bryce. Little kids. I gestured toward Lucia and Marco, who were watching this exchange with wide, frightened eyes. People die all the time. That's life. Chester pushed himself up from where he'd been resting against the wall. I'm going with you, he said. Chester, your knees. My knees'll hurt whether I'm down here or up there. At least up there, I can make myself useful. He walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. Your grandfather saved my life once. 20 years ago, ice storm knocked out my power, and I was too stubborn to ask for help. Emmett drove through that storm in his old pickup truck and sat with me for 3 days until the lines came back on. Said neighbors, take care of neighbors. He looked around the room at the 10 faces watching us. Well, I'm a neighbor, and I'm taking care of mine. The world above was white. Not just snow falling, snow moving, snow flying sideways in sheets so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The wind hit us the moment the hatch opened, a physical force that tried to push us back down the stairs. I'd tied a rope around my waist, the other end secured to a beam near the hatch. 20 feet of slack, enough to reach the ventilation pipes if I moved carefully. Chester was behind me, holding a second rope tied to mine. "Stay low," he shouted over the wind. "Feel for the fence posts. They'll guide you to the vents." I couldn't see anything. The flashlight was useless, its beam swallowed by the swirling white. All I had was touch and direction, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, under all that snow, were the pipes that were keeping 10 people alive. I moved forward on my hands and knees, feeling for the fence posts that my grandfather had used to disguise the ventilation system. The snow was up to my waist when I tried to stand, chest deep when the drifts caught me wrong. The cold was beyond anything I'd experienced. Not just uncomfortable, painful. Every exposed inch of skin burned. My fingers were numb within minutes despite the gloves. I found the first pipe by running into it. Literally. My face hit the metal before I knew it was there. The intake was completely packed. Snow compressed so tightly it might as well have been ice. I dug at it with my gloved hands, scraping and clawing, feeling the frozen chunks fall away piece by piece. Behind me, barely visible through the white, Chester was working on the second pipe. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of exposure that felt like hours. By the time we had both vents clear, I couldn't feel my hands at all. My face was raw. My lungs burned with every breath. But air was moving again. We followed the ropes back to the hatch and descended into warmth that felt like heaven. Loretta was waiting with blankets and hot liquid that might have been coffee or might have been soup. I couldn't tell and didn't care. Chester sat down heavily against the wall, his face gray with exhaustion, cradling his left ankle. "Is it fixed?" Sawyer asked, hovering nearby, his face pale with worry. "It's fixed. For now. Will it happen again? Maybe. But now we know what to look for." I sat down beside Chester, both of us wrapped in blankets, both of us shaking from cold and relief. "Thank you," I said. Chester shook his head. "Thank your grandfather. He's the one who designed those vents to be accessible. Most bunkers, you'd have to dig through 6 feet of concrete to reach them." Emmett thought ahead. From across the room, Garrett Holloway was watching us. His expression had changed since we'd gone outside. There was respect there now, maybe even something like admiration. "That boy just saved all our lives," he said to no one in particular. "Went out in that hell and saved every single one of us." Bryce said nothing, but his eyes, when they met mine, were calculating in a way that made me even more uneasy than before. On the 5th day, the second wave hit. The radio crackled back to life briefly, long enough to deliver the worst possible news. A secondary system had merged with the first, creating what the Weather Service called a catastrophic intensification event. Wind speeds were expected to exceed 80 miles per hour, temperature would drop to -20, and the snow, already measured in feet, would continue for another 36 hours. We heard something collapse, closer this time than before, a groaning of metal followed by a crash that seemed to shake the earth itself. "That was close," Manny whispered. "Henderson's feed barn," Chester said. "About 2 miles west. Roof must have given way under the snow load." "Will this place hold?" Teresa's voice was thin with fear, her arms wrapped protectively around her children. I looked at the ceiling, at the steel beams spaced every 3 feet, at the concrete that was probably 18 inches thick. "This place will hold." But the truth was, I didn't know for certain. My grandfather had built for durability, but no one had ever tested it against a storm like this. That night, with the wind screaming above us and 10 people trying to sleep in a space that felt smaller every hour, Bryce made his move. I woke to the sound of argument. Garrett was standing near the control panel, his face flushed with anger. Bryce was beside him, holding something in his hand that glinted in the emergency light. The key to the generator. "Put it back, Bryce." "Why? Because the orphan says so?" "Because without that generator, people could freeze. Children could freeze. Nobody's going to freeze. There's enough body heat in here to keep everyone alive, even without power. I'm just redistributing control." I got up slowly, trying not to draw attention. "What do you want, Bryce?" He turned to look at me with that calculating expression that had been building for days. I want what's fair. My uncle lost $15,000 because your grandfather backed out of a deal. This land should have been ours. The courts didn't agree. The courts didn't know my uncle paid for this place. The courts only saw what your grandfather's lawyer told them. So what are you suggesting? Bryce smiled. I'm suggesting we renegotiate. Sign the land over to my uncle. He'll let you stay, finish out the storm. Then everyone goes their separate ways. And if I don't, he held up the key, then I hold on to this until you change your mind. No generator means no lights, no heat backup, no ventilation assist. Stale air, cold bodies, bad decisions. Eventually, you'll see reason. There are children here, Bryce. A 5-year-old boy, an 8-year-old girl. You'd let them suffer to get your hands on some land? I'd let them be uncomfortable for a few hours while you decide to stop being stubborn. It's not my fault you're too proud to make the smart choice. Garrett stepped forward. Bryce, this is insane. Put the key back now. Stay out of this, Uncle. I will not stay out of this. You're talking about extortion, about endangering lives. I didn't raise you to be. You didn't raise me at all. Bryce's voice cracked slightly, the mask slipping to reveal something raw underneath. Mom raised me while you were out here farming and pretending to be a good neighbor. You want to take their side? Fine, take their side, but I'm not leaving here without what's owed to us. I looked at this 19-year-old boy, this nephew consumed by grievance, and tried to see him clearly, tried to understand what had brought him to this moment. Bryce, I said quietly, can I tell you something? What? My grandfather wrote 147 letters to the orphanage trying to reach us. 147. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday when he missed us so much he couldn't stand it. Every single one was returned. Bryce's expression flickered, just slightly. They told him we didn't have any living relatives. They told him we were adequately served where we were. He tried to get custody 3 times. Court cases, lawyers, filing fees he couldn't afford. He lost every time, not because he didn't love us, because the system decided that 2 kids in an institution were better off than 2 kids with a grandfather who would have given his life for them. I took a step toward him. You're right that your uncle lost money. That was wrong. My grandfather shouldn't have backed out of the deal without returning the deposit, but he backed out because he found out we existed. He found out his daughter had children before she died, children who were alive, who were in the system, who might someday need a place to come home to. Bryce's hand with the key was shaking slightly. He chose us over money, over contracts, over everything else, and he spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. He died 8 months before the courts finally released us. I was standing right in front of Bryce now, close enough to see the doubt in his eyes, close enough to see the conflict. You can keep that key. You can hold this whole bunker hostage, but it won't change what this place means. It won't change what my grandfather sacrificed, and it won't give your uncle back what he lost. Silence. The wind howled above us. Everyone in the room was watching, barely breathing. Your grandfather was a good man, Loretta said softly. I knew him for 30 years. He never cheated anyone intentionally. If he backed out of that deal, it was because he had a reason, a good reason. The boy's telling the truth, Chester added. I watched Emmett spend every penny he had fighting for those kids, sold his truck, took out loans against this land, did everything short of robbing a bank to pay the lawyers. Garrett walked over to his nephew and put a hand on his shoulder. Bryce, son, this isn't who you are. This isn't who your mother raised you to be. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Bryce's hand began to shake harder. I'm not. He stopped, swallowed, tried again. I just wanted something, to matter somewhere, to have something that was mine, something that proved I wasn't just leftover. The word hung in the air. Leftover. I knew that word. I'd felt that word every day for 6 years in the orphanage. Bryce wasn't so different from us after all. He hurled the key across the room. It hit the concrete wall with a sharp crack and clattered to the floor, spinning in the silence. I just wanted to matter somewhere, he said again, his voice barely a whisper. Loretta crossed the room and, to everyone's surprise, wrapped her arms around the young man who'd threatened us all. You matter, honey. You've always mattered. You just haven't found your place yet. Bryce stood rigid for a moment. Then his shoulders began to shake. I picked up the key and put it back in its place. And somehow, impossibly, the atmosphere in the bunker shifted. The tension that had been building for days began to dissipate, replaced by something else. Something that felt almost like understanding. On the sixth night, Loretta found the second letter. She'd been organizing the metal box, trying to make herself useful while the rest of us waited out the final hours of the storm. The wind had begun to die down. The radio was picking up signals again. The worst was passing. Colton? Her voice was strange, careful. You should look at this. I walked over to where she was sitting, a piece of paper held delicately in her weathered hands. It was in a hidden compartment, under the false bottom of the box. I took the letter. The handwriting was shakier than the first one, like it had been written by someone very ill or very old, someone who knew they were running out of time. My dearest Colton and Sawyer, if you're reading this, it means I've passed and you've finally come home. I'm sorry I'm not there to welcome you properly. I'm sorry for so many things. The letter continued for 2 pages. Every word was like a wound and a blessing at the same time. I wrote 147 letters to St. Catherine's over the years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday, when I missed you so much I couldn't breathe. They all came back. Address unknown. Recipient not at this location. Return to sender. I kept them, every single one. I couldn't throw them away because throwing them away meant admitting you were truly lost to me. So I kept them, and I waited, and I hoped. The courts said I was too old. They said I didn't have enough money. They said you were better off where you were. I tried to prove them wrong, but the system doesn't listen to old men with nothing but love to offer. This shelter is the only thing I could give you that the system couldn't take away. It's not much by some measures. Concrete and steel and some equipment that probably seems outdated by now. But it's yours. It will always be yours. And when the world gets hard, when the wind doesn't stop, when everyone else has failed you, this place will keep you safe. I turned the page with trembling fingers. There's money in an account at First Nebraska Bank. $47,000. Everything I saved over 50 years of working. It's in your names now. Use it to build something. Use it to find happiness. Use it to remember that somewhere, someone loved you enough to never give up. I read the number 3 times. Then I read it again. In the orphanage, we'd learned to count pennies, to hide food because you never knew when the next meal was coming, to wear shoes until the soles fell off because new ones were a luxury no one could afford. $47,000 was more money than I'd ever imagined having, more than I'd ever dreamed of, and our grandfather had saved it for us, penny by penny, year by year, for 50 years. That's, Sawyer's voice cracked, that's a lot of money. It's a life, I said. He gave us a life. The letter ended with words that blurred as I tried to read them through the tears. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I'm sorry I couldn't fight harder. I'm sorry for all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that we lost. But I'm not sorry for building this place, and I'm not sorry for loving you. Your grandfather always... Emmett! I don't know when I started crying. I just know that by the time I finished reading, there were tears running down my face and Sawyer was beside me, his face pressed against my shoulder, crying too. He never stopped, Sawyer whispered. Even when they told him no, even when they sent his letters back, he never stopped trying. No, I said. Not once. Not ever. Loretta was crying too, and Garrett, and Teresa. Even Bryce, standing alone in the corner, had tears in his eyes. Chester walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. There's more, he said quietly. In the hidden compartment behind the control panel. Keep looking. That night something happened that I'll never forget. Sawyer couldn't sleep. The stress of the confrontation with Bryce, the emotional weight of the letters, the sheer exhaustion of everything, it had all caught up with him. He lay on his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, his body rigid with tension. Loretta noticed. She always noticed. Without a word, she walked over and sat down beside him. Then gently she lifted his head and placed it in her lap. It's okay, honey, she murmured, stroking his hair. You can rest now. You're safe. Sawyer's whole body went stiff for a moment. I watched him, knowing exactly what he was feeling. We'd never had this. Never had someone hold us just because we needed holding. Never had a grandmother's hand smooth our hair while we fell asleep. Then slowly, his shoulders relaxed. His breathing evened out. His eyes closed. And for the first time since we'd left the orphanage, my brother slept like a child who knew he was loved. Loretta looked up at me, tears streaming silently down her face. My son would have been 28 this year, she whispered. I've missed having someone to take care of. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. And I understood finally that we weren't the only ones who'd been waiting to find a family. We found them just after midnight, 147 letters, bundled with string, and tucked into the hidden space behind the control panel. Each one in its own envelope, each one addressed to St. Catherine's Home for Children. Each one marked with the same terrible stamp, Return to Sender. They spanned 10 years. The first one was written when I was 8 years old and Sawyer was 3. Dear Colton, I hope this letter finds you well. I am your grandfather, Emmett Webb. I don't know if anyone has told you about me, but I am your mother's father. She was my only child, and losing her broke something in me that will never fully heal. But you and your brother are still here. You are still in the world, and as long as you are in the world, I will never stop trying to find you. I live in Nebraska, on land that's been in our family for 4 generations. It's quiet here. The sky goes on forever. I think you would like it. I'm building something for you, a place that will be yours someday. I don't know when I'll be able to bring you home, but when I do, I want there to be something waiting, something that proves you were always wanted. Happy 8th birthday, Colton. I hope someone gave you cake. With all my love, Grandpa Emmett. We read them all. Every birthday letter, every Christmas message, every note written on ordinary days when he missed us and couldn't think of any other way to feel close to us. Dear Sawyer, you are 5 years old today. I wonder what you look like now. I wonder if you have your mother's smile. Dear Colton, the lawyers say we lost the appeal again. I don't understand how this keeps happening. How can wanting your own grandchildren be the wrong thing? Dear both of you, it's Thanksgiving. I cooked a turkey anyway, even though there's no one here to share it. Set 3 places at the table anyway. Pretended you were here anyway. Dear Sawyer, I'm sorry I missed your birthday again. I was in the hospital this time. My heart, they said. It's getting tired, but I'm not giving up. I'm never giving up. The last letter was dated 2 weeks before he died. Dear Colton and Sawyer, I don't think I have much time left. The doctors use words like prepare and comfortable and palliative. I know what those words mean. I'm writing this from the bunker. It's finished now. Everything works. Everything is ready. All it's missing is you. I've arranged for the property to transfer to you when I'm gone. The lawyers finally agreed it was possible now that Colton is almost 18. The system will have to let you go eventually, and when it does, this place will be waiting. I wish I could see your faces when you read this. I wish I could show you around, explain how everything works, tell you all the stories about your mother and this land and the life I hoped we'd have together. But since I can't, I'll say this instead. You are loved. You have always been loved, and nothing the system did to keep us apart will ever change that. Find each other. Take care of each other. Build something good on this land. And know that somewhere, somehow, I'm proud of you. Forever yours. Grandpa Emmett Sawyer was curled up against me, his face buried in my shoulder. I held the letters in my shaking hands and let the tears come. 147 letters. 10 years of trying. A lifetime of love that never stopped, even when the world said it should. He kept believing we'd come home, Sawyer said, his voice muffled against my shirt. Even when everyone told him it was impossible. That's who he was, Sawyer. That's the kind of man our grandfather was. I have to pause here one more time. 147 letters. 10 years of trying. A grandfather who loved his grandchildren so much that even when the system told him no, even when his letters came back unopened, even when his body began to fail, he kept writing. Have you ever loved someone like that? Have you ever fought for someone against impossible odds? Have you ever found proof, years later, That someone was fighting for you all along? If this story has touched you, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. We share stories about hope, about second chances, about finding family in unexpected places. And I hope you'll leave a comment telling me about your own story, about the people who never gave up on you, about the love that reached across time and distance and circumstance. Your story matters. It might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Now let me tell you how this ends. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th day. I opened the hatch just after dawn and stood there, blinking in the sudden light. The snow had stopped, the wind had died, the sky was a pale winter blue, clear and cold and impossibly still after so many days of violence. The landscape had been transformed. Snow covered everything in drifts that rose above my head in some places. The fence lines had vanished completely. The road was invisible. Every familiar landmark was buried under a white blanket that stretched to the horizon in every direction. But we were alive. 10 people who had gathered in an underground chamber, built by a man they barely knew, designed for emergencies most of them had never imagined, had survived the worst storm in Nebraska's recorded history. No frostbite, no serious injuries, no casualties. Just 10 people, blinking in the winter sunlight, breathing air that had never tasted so sweet. Garrett was the first to speak. "We should dig out," he said. "Check on the neighbors. See who else made it." The work took hours. Snow had to be moved by hand, one shovelful at a time. The drifts were packed so tightly that they felt more like ice than powder. But we worked together, all 10 of us. Even Bryce, who dug harder than anyone else, like he was trying to prove something, like he was trying to atone. By afternoon, we'd cleared enough to move freely around the property. The ventilation pipes were visible again, rising from the snow like periscopes. The hatch was fully accessible. Chester looked at the bunker and shook his head slowly. 20 years I helped Emmett build this place. 20 years he talked about why it mattered. I never really understood until now. "What did he say?" I asked. "About why he built it?" He said, Chester paused, choosing his words carefully. He said structures can fail people. Systems can fail people. But love doesn't fail. Love just waits until you're ready to receive it. He looked at me with something like wonder in his old eyes. I think he was right. The rescue crews arrived 4 days later. By then, we'd heard enough radio reports to know the scope of the disaster. Hundreds of thousands without power across 3 states. Dozens of deaths in the rural areas. Damage in the billions. The storm they were calling the October apocalypse. But in our little corner of Nebraska, on 40 acres of land with an obsolete bunker underneath, 10 people had survived without incident. The engineers who came to inspect the shelter were openly amazed. "This design isn't obsolete," one of them said, examining the reinforced ceiling with obvious professional appreciation. "It's overbuilt. By modern standards, it's almost excessive. But that's exactly why it held." "The builder knew what he was doing," another added. "This wasn't paranoia. This was engineering. Damn good engineering." They asked questions, took measurements, made notes. One of them mentioned something about studying the design for future emergency shelters. I just watched them work and thought about my grandfather. The people left slowly, in ones and twos, as roads became passable and power was restored. Manny shook my hand and pressed a piece of paper into my palm. "My farm is 20 miles south. We always need help during planting and harvest. If you're looking for work, the job is yours." Teresa hugged me like I was her own son. "You saved my children. I'll never forget that." Never. Lucia and Marco waved goodbye from their parents' truck, their small faces pressed against the glass until they disappeared around the bend. Chester stayed longest. He walked through the bunker one more time, touching the walls, checking the systems, saying goodbye to the place he'd helped build. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, "not just because you survived, because of how you did it, because you led when leadership was needed, because you protected people who needed protecting." I just did what he would have done. "Exactly." Chester smiled, the first real smile I'd seen on his weathered face. "Exactly." Garrett and Loretta were the last to leave. Garrett shook my hand formally, but there was warmth in his grip that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry about Bryce, about the trouble he caused. He's young, he'll learn." "Will you?" Garrett looked at me seriously. Will you learn how to be a neighbor? How to ask for help when you need it? How to accept that you're not alone anymore? I thought about the question. I'll try. That's all any of us can do. Loretta didn't shake my hand. She hugged me. Then she hugged Sawyer, holding him tight for a long moment. Then she held both of us at arm's length and looked at us with tears in her eyes. You boys come for dinner on Sunday. Every Sunday. As long as you're living on this land, you eat at our table on Sundays. Understood? Sawyer looked at me with wide, hopeful eyes. Yes, ma'am, I said. We understand. And if you need anything at all, you call. Day or night. Doesn't matter. You're not orphans anymore. You're neighbors, and neighbors take care of each other. She kissed both our foreheads. Then she walked out into the winter sunshine, leaving us alone in the bunker that had saved so many lives. 1 month later, the land was still buried under snow, but the drifts were shrinking day by day. The roads had been plowed, power had been restored throughout the county. The world was returning to normal, but nothing would ever be normal for us again. We'd spent the months settling in, making the bunker a home instead of just a shelter. Sawyer had a real bed now, assembled from pieces we'd ordered with some of the money from Grandpa Emmett's account. I had a workspace near the control panel where I was learning to maintain all the systems Chester had taught me about. The walls had pictures on them now, the photographs from the metal box, our mother's smile, our grandfather's serious eyes, our own faces as babies, held in arms we'd never known. We'd even started making plans, a small house to build above ground when spring came, a garden plot Loretta had helped us map out. Maybe some chickens, Chester suggested. Every farm needs chickens. We were standing outside when the sun started to set, watching the sky turn colors over the white fields, orange and pink and purple, painted across the horizon like someone was showing off. Colton, yeah? Sawyer was holding one of the letters. He'd been reading them again. He read a different one every day now, like he was trying to memorize our grandfather's voice. This one is from my 5th birthday. He says he made a cake but didn't have anyone to share it with. I remember that one. He made a cake for someone who wasn't there, and he probably sat alone and looked at it and wished we could blow out the candles. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Do you think, Sawyer paused, do you think he's somewhere, like somewhere he can see us now? I thought about it, about belief and faith and all the things I'd never had much use for in the orphanage, where prayers seemed to go unanswered and hope was just another word for disappointment. I don't know, I said honestly, but I think love doesn't just disappear. I think it stays somewhere, even after the person is gone, in the things they built, in the letters they wrote, in the people they loved. Sawyer nodded slowly. He built all this for us? Yeah. And he wrote all those letters even when they came back? Yeah. And he kept believing we'd come home, even when everyone told him we wouldn't. That's who he was, Sawyer. That's the kind of man our grandfather was. Sawyer looked at the sunset. His face was calm in a way I'd never seen before. Settled. At peace. I'm glad we came, he said. I'm glad we didn't sell the land. Me too. Do you think we'll be okay here? I looked at the bunker entrance, at the ventilation pipes rising like sentinels, at the 40 acres of snow-covered land that belonged to us now, at the life we were just beginning to build. Yeah, Sawyer, I think we'll be okay. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen on his face since we left the orphanage. Maybe the first real smile I'd ever seen on his face. Hey, Colton. Yeah? I love you. The words hit me like a physical force. Sawyer didn't say things like that. Neither of us did. We'd learned early that love was a vulnerability, that expressing it gave people power over you. But here in this place our grandfather had built with his own hands, surrounded by evidence of a love that never gave up, the words didn't feel dangerous anymore. They felt true. I love you too, Sawyer. We stood together and watched the sun go down. Behind us, the bunker waited, the shelter our grandfather had built, the inheritance he'd left us, the proof that we had always been wanted, always been loved, always been fighting toward home. They called it obsolete. They called it worthless. They called it a liability. But they were wrong. It was a promise kept after death, a love letter written in concrete and steel, a home waiting for children who didn't know they were coming. And we were finally here. Not because the system had released us, not because anyone had rescued us, but because a man we barely remembered had spent his entire life building us a place to belong. 147 letters, 3 court cases, 20 years of construction, 50 years of savings, all of it leading to this moment. 2 brothers standing on land that was finally, truly theirs. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of snow and pine and something else, something that might have been hope. "Hey, Colton," Sawyer said. "Yeah? I think Grandpa can see us now." I looked at the sky, at the first stars appearing in the darkening blue. "Yeah, Sawyer, I think he can." And somewhere, in a place beyond letters and courtrooms and concrete walls, I knew an old man was finally smiling. His grandsons had come home. "Thank you for staying with Colton and Sawyer until the end." Their grandfather wrote 147 letters that never arrived. But the message still got through. The love still found its way home. If this story touched you, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. We share stories about hope, about second chances, about finding family in the most unexpected places. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that someone loved you more than you knew? Have you ever found proof of a love that never gave up? Leave a comment. Share your story, because sometimes the best thing we can do for each other is prove that love really does find a way. Until next time, take care of each other. The end.